So I want to keep this simple, and the plan is just that we will have like an opening round where I ask you to kind of give us your key insights of this conference, and yeah, maybe shift in your own thinking over the course of the debate. So I'd be interested in hearing about that. And then we'll have the second round where we can discuss like huge course of the debate and how, if at all, do we move forward in realism debate. I think we discuss this. And then I want to open this up to everyone. And yeah, I want to jump you in and like share your thoughts, comments, questions, whatever, and see where this is going. We scheduled around 1.5 hours, but I mean, we can make this earlier if you feel like everything's been said in seconds. All right, so Kyle, why don't you start?
Thanks, and it seems like natural time for us to thank the organizers again for this really good stuff. Delightful. Sorry, but let's see. So I'm not sure. So I have been thinking a lot about, I guess, what I'm going to say in my second round thing, because I'm going to make this suggestion about the debate going forward that I think will make some people mad. And so I'm going to advertise that's coming. But in the meantime, I would say that in a way the funniest thing that the conference has convinced me of is what a good idea it was to hold this conference. Because when I first, I had an invitation and it says, "Oh, we're going to do this kind of thing," I said, "Well, that's a good thing. That will be questions on I see, a lot of people talking about they want to talk about the why are we doing this and what are we doing kind of thing." But this has really proved illuminated. In a way, this forum for talking about realism, I think, was the most effective I've ever seen for understanding that there are multiple different things going on, and that there isn't even a central or fundamental opposition in the realism debate. The different people are really worried about quite different things, and this conference, I think, has been particularly good, even compared to other realism conferences. At trying to make clear what the real disagreements are and which things are supposed to help resolve which kinds of disagreements. And so it's been more useful just for the first order thinking about really making any progress and the steps to take in the middle of the debate itself. And it's in part of, I think, a product of the design, the intentional design of the company. That's what I think.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Well, in response to Frederick's suggestion that we say something about how we grew as philosophers while here, I just want to say that I'd like to double down on every conviction I had before I came. My mind is unchanged.
You know, your confidence.
That's right. That's right. It's been very productive. Very, very productive. No, of course, that's not the case. But I did think I might say a couple of things about some of the potential concerns that motivated the conference in the first place. I think one of them was the idea that the realism debate is in a kind of funk. I think the term that was used was stalemate, right? And I think one thing that was helpful to see in action in this conference is that the term stalemate has different connotations. One of them, is a state of affairs in which no resolution of a dispute is or seems possible. And that, I think, may well be true, right? It might even be true for principled reasons if you take a stance on realism very seriously. But I don't think that's a worry. Precisely because there's another sense of stalemate, which is a state of affairs in which progress and discussion between opposing parties is or seems impossible. And that, I think, is not a good characterization of this at all. I think we made a tremendous amount of progress, even in just the last day and a half. But I think the way in which the positions, even if the dispute ends up not being resolvable in the sense that we all sign up to exactly the same charter of beliefs, is incredibly valuable because our positions, I think, are becoming clearer, more detailed in their specification. And that has really good downstream effects, I think, which is the next thing I wanted to say. I think the elaborating of causal positions here, getting clear on what the differences still are, getting some clarity on what we might have taken to be opposed positions and discovered that, in fact, not opposed positions or positions that we thought were the same, but it turns out actually, no, we're not talking about something. That's been incredibly valuable. So I learned a lot, for example, about the different accounts of localism and particularism, or globalism and generalism. That was a really fruitful discussion for me because I saw a lot of actually convergence among the different views that I heard. While I still think that there are some interesting differences, I saw a lot of differences. Similarly, with respect to the stats of altruism and epistemology discussions, I think one of the things that's been super fruitful and exciting for me is to see the various ways in which people are running that idea in slightly different directions, which actually do, I think, invite some really interesting questions about how some of the differences in detail among these accounts might be really fruitful to think about. Some of them, may turn into really serious disagreements, and others may turn into less serious disagreements. But I think thinking through those things is really, really fruitful. And I'm inspired to think about some of those things in just a couple of days. And then there's, of course, just the time honored what we mentioned at the start, the productive tension of sharpening our own positions in the light of these kinds of discussions. This is my favorite kind of meeting. I much, much, much prefer being in a small room with a small number of people talking about some issues for a few days, preferably at the temperature of 32 or 33 degrees. Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a great thing. I want to say that another thing is something that follows from one of the things I said already is that one of the other concerns that was expressed before the conference, that is the idea that there's a lot of people talking past one another in these debates, is something that I think is much less likely. It's certainly much less excusable, but I also think it's much less likely as a result of these kinds of discussions. I think that it was actually much more likely and much more excusable for people to have been talking past one another, say, in the 1970s and the 80s, when it really wasn't clear what it might mean for someone to be a realist or an anti-realist. I mean, even to this day, our friend and my former student, Boaz Miller, wrote a paper on what is Hackning's argument for entity realism, right? I mean, it wasn't clear what a lot of those positions were actually about. And I think in the course of the development of the last few decades, and certainly, people in this room trying to be very careful about teasing out what precisely it is that they have in mind, it's much less likely that we're going to talk past one another because it's just a lot clearer. And there's been a lot of excellent work being done to actually develop these positions to the extent that we can talk about them in really fruitful ways. So those are my main points.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks. Well, I feel as though this conference has had two kind of interrelated themes. And the first sort of part of it, I think, was sort of to do with, spiraling around the localism issue. And then we moved in the second part into the diagnosing ourselves, having this disagreement, thinking in terms of stances, connecting with social epistemology, like disagreement, deep disagreement, strategies from there for solving it. I guess maybe since we can come back to say how we see it moving forward, mostly just focus now on the first part. So what this conference has actually made me think a little bit, and I'm very curious if people agree, is there's this feeling of a degenerating debate. But actually, maybe it's what we actually have here, a converging debate. That's what I was beginning to wonder. So as I see it, you've got two big kind of anti-realism camps, right? You've got the empiricist camp, which we are that process we have explained. And then you've got this sort of more historical and people like I remain exposed to that. Now, what I think is sort of happening in the course of this conference is that we have come to kind of some agreement, I think, about the first one. In the sense that I sense discomfort and a sort of willingness to throw the observable, unobservable distinction under the bus and move on from there. Now, does that mean that we abandon the whole empiricist project? I think maybe what we've come to see is that, like, maybe cashing out that empiricist project and trying to stick close to experience, try not to step too far into metaphysical nasty territories, that doesn't have to be cashed out in terms of discussion. So, but then there's also reasons from, just being uncomfortable about how exactly we'll apply. I think these benefits kind of expressing some of those sorts of concerns, and anybody who's given trying to teach scientific realism, most it's good. It's really awkward in trying to be observable and observable extension. Okay, so suppose we've sort of come to agree. So the question is, have we agreed that we're picking out the observable and observable extension? But we still see ourselves as kind of moving forward with a general empiricist kind of approach to it. That's the first question. But now, with respect to the sort of the other form of the other major form of anti-realism, the more historical tradition. So I should also say perhaps that in that first part of the debate with the empiricists, it seems like there's a sort of tendency to want to move in a sort of more localist, naturalist kind of direction. I saw a similar move, like, no, I'm going to be asking you if this is correct to say. So back in the old days, I feel as though Stanford and others, the historical form of anti-realism, were more, running bigger arguments, like running arguments that, like, there's a sort of general problem of unconceived alternatives, which might lead us to a sort of general skepticism about science. Now, in this talk, I thought it was a move more towards, it's definitely a naturalist position, so in that it shares the same move that everybody's making in respect to the empiricist camp, but it's also on the generality, particularist axis, moving more in the direction of particularism, but not all the way. And so that's interesting. So then we end up in a kind of middle ground where it's the approach is supposed to be naturalistic, somewhat particularist or local, and Cosmos sketched some sort of meta normative framework that we could use to sort of try and really theorize what that middle ground looks like. So here's my question about this progression, because this is what's happening. Now, I start to lose track of whether there are two sides in this discussion anymore. So if an anti-realist is somebody who sort of gives us, if you like, some cautionary notes, who says, well, look, we see that this particular inference form doesn't work so well and so we should be cautious. Now this is all more contextual, but there are situations where we should be more careful with this one. Then I'm wondering who the realist is now. Like, are they someone who's kind of like refusing to make the cautionary notes, or and so I sort of feel as though in that respect, maybe what is there is a convergence of the positions in the sense that, well, at least it seems that, yeah, sure, and any individual patient can still take sort of more, a more or less cautious interpretation, but there's many dimensions to that. Do we really have realists and anti-realists? It looks a bit like what we have is a sort of really interesting project of trying to work out what this naturalist localism looks like, what kind of connections we should have to between philosophers and scientists, how exactly social epistemology should figure into it. And I just wonder whether the realism debate it kind of went away, did it?
Years ago, Kenneth Nagel said that philosophy kind of goes through cycles with respect to how methodologically and critically self-aware and self-reflective it is. And we're in the phase of the cycle now where philosophy is exceptionally self-critical, methodologically self-aware. And I think this is the case in the philosophy of science, particularly the scientific realism debate, and this conference is an example of that. And we've had amazing meta-level reflections for the last few days. One question, I suppose, is, what impact is all of this meta-level work going to have on the first order work? And one concern could be that it's not going to have very much impact. Things are going to go on pretty much as they were before. These meta-level reflections kind of leave everything as it is, the way that Wittgenstein said. I think one of the concerns that Marty had about the stance approach is that it's not obvious how it contributes to making progress on the first order scientific realism debates. And these are genuine questions, concerns, but partly, I think, because most of us are both doing the first order, if you like, or after this conference, I'm not sure about just the things you put in first order and the second order stuff. But most of us are doing both the first order work and the second order reflections, which makes it more likely that the second order, the meta level reflections are going to have an impact on our first order work. And we've had a lot of great proposals like this, striking how many of the presentations are focused on positive ways forward as opposed to just saying it's a stalemate or giving a diagnosis of why it's a stalemate or something like a stalemate. We don't use that. So with that, Bruno talking about the possibility of non-adversarial collaboration, Kyle talking about a whole new approach that perhaps all sides in the debate can get on board with, Peter talking about getting beyond rhetorical disagreement, understanding that we fundamentally agree on a lot of things, Cosmos and Stathis talking about an intermediate view between globalism and localism, Curtis and Bobby with their kind of common ground sort of things. So this is all, it's striking how kind of collaborative, how kind of ecumenical, I think, the approach many people have taken has been. But I'll just end on stances. So I remember when the empirical stance came out in 2002, and I was in grad school, and it's not very often that you sort of come across a philosophical idea that you just think, well, that's just obviously right. And that was sort of the case for me. In those early years, there weren't many people working on the stance idea, and some of the work wasn't at the highest standard. And I just think now, it's 23 years later, and just think of the quality of the work that's been done around this area, the different ways, the different directions which it's been taken. I was so inspired, given my personal interest, by the talks that focused on the question of stances, their nature and role, this conference. And just to kind of plead the value of stances, because there's perhaps a worry that actually the sense that there's a kind of stalemate or lack of progress or something peculiarly problematic about the scientific realism debate. Okay, the stance diagnosis can help to kind of explain that, but that just kind of makes things even worse because it shows that how little chance there is that we can actually make progress. And there's an American philosopher of biology, Rose Novick, and in response to my paper arguing that functionalism and structuralism in biology should be understood as Van Prastian stances, and we can construct a very similar argument to the one that Van Prastian offers for materialism, for interpreting functionalism and structuralism as stances. And she basically said, look, Boucher might be right on the descriptive question, but I hope he's not right, because it would be a really bad thing, because there would be stances in science, because it's just entrenched positions, ideological oppositions, large scale, theoretical disagreement that just leads to lack of progress and, bitter disputes, and stymies the kind of integrative, collaborative work that we need to do. And the rebuttal to that, and this shows it's kind of very little news under the sun. In 1969, German philosopher Heinrich Heine wrote an article where she talked about something that she called metatheoretic commitments, very similar to stances in Von Parsons' sense. And she was talking about the continuity of these kind of large-scale theoretical commitments in biology that you find manifested in the debate between vitalists and mechanists in the 18th and 19th centuries, and the same basic philosophical opposition persists today in the then dispute between molecular biologists in the 60s and organicists, right? Same philosophical sort of opposition manifesting itself in different theoretical disagreements throughout the history of science. The real continuity of these things that she calls metatheoretic commitments, and she says, quite different to what Novik is saying, this is actually a really good thing, because this kind of entrenched opposition leads to each side having to clarify their positions, improve their arguments, clarify their concepts, respond to challenges from the other side, and you can see that both positions, both the general stances and the more specific theoretical scientific claims, have been sharpened and improved, and it's been a good thing. Okay, it's a stance debate, not because it's fair. I think it's actually potentially a very positive thing within science, but also within the philosophy of science.
Yeah. The first thing I learned is there's no use starting a suit all the way from Canada to Europe in the summer. And also that going last is a good and bad thing. You sometimes have a lot of modifications that you can make to whatever you were planning to say, and sometimes they get said, which is most of what I was going to say has been said here already. I will speak a little more personally on this then. What struck me is just how collaborative this debate has become. I think that's a few people have said that already. And it does seem like we're sort of converging on a very productive set of agreements that don't dismiss or don't suggest there's no more work to be done, but that now we can be doing that work together. And it's seeing the way that the conversation has progressed in the 7 or so years that I haven't been an active participant or anything, and the way that even my work has influenced some other people's work and found it important is just a reminder, I think, that what we're doing here matters. That these questions can sometimes feel very rarefied, impractical, extremely perniciously academic. But I think everyone here, to some degree, whether they're as explicitly pragmatist as I am, are looking to make contributions that matter. Not, to just overly intellectualize anything, but to actually come to common ground and look into questions that matter to all the people in this room, but also to many other people outside of the specific realism debate, or outside of philosophy of science, even, or even outside of philosophy. And so I want to just sort of end on a congratulatory note that I think we've made some progress, and that we should be proud. I think it's all I have to say on that.
Yeah, so the question is, as we move forward in the realism debate, and we've already heard a lot of optimism about that, which is good. So I would suggest that now we hear Kai's radical suggestion, and then, yeah, everyone can jump on it, or you can also comment on the statements of the others.
Great, thanks. Let me start by saying just a couple words that I'm looking at responsive to some of the things that Leah was sort of asking me what I thought about. I think it's a captivating description that in the old days where I was that we were running bigger arguments, right? I think of that in a way as also simpler, right? More blockage of arguments, and I do think it's fair to characterize me as having moved from more think of myself as defending an instrumentalist position about scientific theories to, I think, you feel like being naturalistic, but also the more piecemeal explanation of relevant differences between cases. I would pause and say this is one of my most frustrating things about the book, though. What the book says is not that instrumentalism is right. It says that unconceived alternatives are the real thing to worry about. And what we have to go figure out is when that's really a problem and when it isn't. And the very first thing I did after writing the book was go do the fossils paper, where I said, it's absurd to think that unconceived alternatives are really a problem here. Now, why is that? What makes that the case in this situation? And for me, from the beginning, does not look, it's easy to cast as a case for instrumentalism because all these theories where I'm going to say, unlike someone convinced by numerical arguments, no, I don't think we have good enough evidence to just believe that that's an accurate description of the world, right? So I think that if you take the problem seriously, you get worried about a whole bunch of things, worried about believing a whole bunch of things that realists believe. But the point of the project in the beginning was to say, this is what we actually have to worry about, not a skeptical determination. This is what we actually have to worry about. Now let's get down to figuring out when it's a real problem and when it isn't. That slide I skipped over where I said I was right about everything all along, of course. That's what I was saying there. Is right. That so that this new kind of or not new, old, very old, the kind of natural philosophy I was advocating for, I take to be a contribution to that thing. I was sort of I've been asking all of you to get busy doing from the beginning. So finally, that connection with respect to are there still two sides, right? I mean, so someone was kind enough to mention this midway forward paper that I wrote, and in that paper, I was doing my very best effort to identify all these ways in which it seems to me that sensible realists and anti-realists or instrumentalist positions had converged, at least the people who were more about history than anything else, right? Really had converged, and that's where these principles got mentioned. I think in the talk that you were doing, but the commensurability and uniformitarianism principle, and that's also where that Matty Wilson principle that I talked about comes from. So look, these are really important subtle things that the original debaters did not agree about. So we have come to agree about. But I don't think we lose two different positions, because I think the two sides of that, once you agree, can and should agree about all that stuff, but still have quite divergent pictures of what the future of science is going to be like, right? Whether we will or will not look back from the point of view of the future science, look back and say, well, yeah, those guys believe some important true things about nature, but the framework they use to express them and many of the substantive claims, no, we don't think those are true. We don't think that what we believe now is just a refinement or an elaboration of the same fundamental thing they believed, in just the same way that we ourselves look back and say, yeah, what we believe now is not just an elaboration of what we believe. It's not just an expansion of what Priestley believed, right? No, we think we believe something different now. And you can agree about all the things I think we brought ourselves to agreement about and still disagree about that. That's to disagree about what the force of the historical evidence really tells us. And so I don't think we lose two sides. What I do think, and the other thing I argue in that paper, and somebody else in a different type, I'm really sorry, I can't remember which or which, was pointing out the big moral of that paper is that the shared project is more important than the debate. And we're making real progress in the shared project of figuring out the details of, oh, what are good, better and worse signs of, when to be cautious, or what are good bets, what are bad bets. That's now what I was trying to make happen with that paper is general sense. Look, we've come. There's been so much convergence. We are engaged in a shared project now, and we roughly agree about how to get information about trying to do that better and better. And then that's actually more important than even wondering about did anyone win the original debate, right? That's a question I've lost interest in.
Yeah.
But I'll talk about people who think I won. That's interesting to me. But I've lost interest in the original question.
That's just one person.
That's right. That's very important different pieces, isn't it? Okay, sorry. Now, so that's what I was wanted to say about that, those things. Let me try to speed up here and introduce what I think will be an unwelcome and unfortunate note of dissonance in these extremely collegial and collaborative proceedings. But it's a sign, again, I think a sign of the success of the conference, because yesterday's discussions and talks really helped me figure out a bunch of things that I didn't already think about the stances thing in the scientific realism thing. And so this articulated word about the stance, the focus on stances. But it's this thing, useful things people are saying at this very conference that has helped me sort of figure out, come to see things in the way that I'm about to describe. So here's what I'm worried about. Insofar as, look, stances, we just heard, stances are important across a wide range of contexts, and there's lots of different interesting kinds of things to say about them. I don't want to disagree with any of that. But insofar as stances are being introduced in order to explain persistent disagreement or stalemate or fight in the character of the realism debate, I think that suggests a misleading picture of what's really going on, or where the real action in the debate lies. And so let me try to articulate that. So I do think that the persistent disagreement between von Frosten or constructive empiricists and scientific realists really is importantly connected to stances and voluntarism about them, and especially their relative tolerance for risk, right? I think that's true and an important insight about the difference between von Frosten constructive empiricists and scientific realists. But if we think that the most important challenge to scientific realism comes from the history of science, that persistent disagreement, I don't think, has much at all to do with stances or different tolerances for risk. Instrumentalists who are motivated by the historical record do not disagree with realists about risk tolerance. They disagree about what the historical evidence shows the actual risks to be. And that stances, I don't think, are a helpful way of trying to capture or see that, right? It is not, so it can be tempting, especially if you think about von Frosten, you think, oh yeah, this is really just, kind of a different, the stance thing is a difference about how risk tolerant you're prepared to be. But to whatever extent you agree with me that the historical case is the really compelling one to worry about scientific realism, I don't think it is fundamentally a difference in risk tolerance or anything like it. It's a difference in the estimation of the actual risks in light of the evidence. Lots of history of science. Okay. And of course, part of why this is, puts me in this little minority of not letting, just saying, yeah, everything's great, that's super great, right? And everything's importantly interconnected, and so yes, everything's super equally valuable or something. It's not that you couldn't be interested in other things, but I was trying to suggest in my talk that debate, the one that's historically motivated and continues between realists and instrumentalists, and that I think is a difference about in evaluation of the risk, not risk tolerance, right? That's the special place, the place that's special in some way, I was suggesting, where history and philosophy of science really have the most to offer the first order project of scientific, naturalistic project of figuring out what the world is like. And to the extent that we think of stances as the right way to think about or explain persistent disagreement in the realism debate, we are distorting, we're distracting ourselves away from that that fundamental fact. Okay, so even I do believe all this. Maybe it would be a good place to start this anyway, because it gives people reason to get out the long knives and sharpen them up. But I recognize that as pushing in the opposite direction of lots of what we've been saying about the utility of this. I agree with all the things about the utility of what we've been doing. But here's a lesson I don't think everybody is going to be happy to take away, but there is a lesson I'm taking. I've run up everyone might no, that's okay.
Perhaps we can start on the other side. Do you want to react, Curtis?
Sure, yeah.
So your first is
Oh, thank you so much for that. Yeah, that's incredibly insightful, Kyle. I really like that division between the two sort of issues that we've been dealing with, right? Because Van Frossen very proudly says, like my argument for constructive empiricism has nothing to do with pessimistic induction, right? And those dividing up those two debates is important, and I really like your take on it that that historical assessment, using history to assess the relative risks of variable commitments. It is still a very open question that's almost been forgotten by the focus on stances. Just as a hot take on it, right? I do think something like a decision theoretic framework is going to be helpful as we look to revive that and refocus our energy there on the assumption that we've sort of sorted out. So, maybe we're going to refocus over on that question. But I do think that I would push back on the idea that the stance stuff has nothing to offer.
Yeah, I don't want to be saying that, but
okay, sorry. I'll put the stronger version out there. I have something to stab.
That is entirely reasonable, given what I said.
Yeah. And I think it's because it's almost quieted down the vociferousness with which some of that stuff started, right? You look at Putnam and that era of the debate, it's a lot of really just like fist banging, table thumping. How could what's the other explanation that it could possibly be? And everybody's very frustrated by this. And I think saying, look, we've sort of carved out these different attitudes, really well characterized them, and stratified our understanding of stances and all this stuff. Gives us a sort of safe place to all be friends, and to do that collaborative work of assessing those relative risks in a way that is maybe going to be very productive, not just for the rarefied field of philosophy, but for that close to what matters, stuff of scientific practice, right, and scientific results, and helping scientists sort of hedge their bets in the kinds of commitments they make, because that stuff is really important, as we've seen in several talks, for things like policy making, for very practical matters that make a difference to not just us as individuals, but the future of humanity. Not to make it, to make it sort of the most pointed statement to it, but I think that's true, right? Getting these things right, well, but the future-proof science is, as it is super important. Matters for the way that we govern our society. Things like ripple effects.
I think that's well said, and also that there's some really nice support for it, and that we saw it in Sandy's talk, right? The people who are saying, "No, what I'm saying doesn't depend on a stance. You just like look at this shit and you have to believe it." Those people now look weird, right?
Yeah.
You very effectively made them look like the kind of nutty ones for insisting that what their beliefs should have nothing to do with the kinds of things we're talking about in stances, and so that seems to be a natural way to sort of illustrate what you're talking about the sort of, maybe it's not a breakdown here, but a more kind of global shift in people's expectations and attitudes about what they're trying to say. Sorry, this is me talking again, but I think Sandy's talk gives a couple excellent examples of exactly the kind of positive impact you're talking about.
No, I'm good.
I really appreciate Kyle's point because I too have wondered whether and how the historical challenge to scientific realism fits into the stance picture. I suppose there are three possibilities. One is we'll find a way to make it fit. A second is it doesn't fit, and that shows that the stance approach is deeply problematic in itself. And the third is it doesn't fit, but it doesn't really matter because the stance approach kind of captures the debates around constructive empiricism and empiricism versus scientific realism of various strengths in terms of epistemic risk and all this stuff. And then over here you have the historical critique, and that's just a kind of different debate. Live and let live. I'm tempted, and I really don't know whether this would work. Anjan will have more intelligent things to say about this, but I'm tempted to invoke the point I made in my talk about arguments for and against scientific realism being stance dependent. To try and shoehorn the historical challenge stuff into the stance approach. Would you argue that if you adopted the empiricist stance, so it's not even an option for you, so left is resistant, and so on, then you don't even have any reason to think about, to worry about the historical argument? That presupposes the truth of theories and the existence of certain entities is on the table, something we need to discuss. But that's not even something you care about if your values define you to accept empiricist stance. All that stuff is in my sense. Whereas if you adopt the realist stance, then the historical challenge to realism becomes something you really got to worry about. I have no idea if that works because it's just something I thought of then, but possibly a way to go.
I think Curtis just comments on that. That reminds me actually of the argument of my MA thesis, which was that adopting a sort of constructive empiricist or empiricist outlook doesn't allow you the kind of projective predictions in many scenarios that really matter. Like climate models are incredibly novel in their predictions, right? And my argument there was, if you're an empiricist, you look at that and you say, well, I don't know, we're going to have to wait and see what that outcome is going to be to determine if it's empirically adequate. You're not sort of licensed the projection from, I have this empirically adequate model here and this empirically adequate model here. We tested them rigorously. But when we combine them, they make this other novel prediction. Well, we're going to have to go test it before I make that kind of commitment. So if the idea is that there's a kind of like practical chemistry based on this historical type of projection, that's a very fruitful path that we might go down and start investigating those things as a future direction of the state that kind of bridges the two aspects that Kyle's identified.
And Leah?
Yeah, okay, so again, I see a bunch of agreement, I think, like, the stance is if you want to capture a sort of standoff between a realist and constructive empiricist and moving to stances to try and adjudicate that that sits well with what all the starts of discussion has been saying that the debates kind of got this, a bit sort of intractable character. But that seemed to sort of sit a bit oddly with the now moving to the history of science arena, where it seems as though we've got this kind of convergence on a sort of project. And it's very helpful that you said, there are two still, a realist and on the other side. But I still want to ask the question a little bit. I can see that, but are there more than two sides now? Wouldn't there be actually lots of sides? And this is where I think the connection to the start stuff might the way I would see it now, I think, is to say what we've seen actually, especially this morning, is and especially in this last 2 days, is the development of the stance idea and sort of unraveling it and taking, there to be different levels of it, different more scientific ways to push it out. Now, I think it's quite compatible with the idea that in the history of science debate now, everybody's agreed that this isn't just a matter of following the first order scientific evidence, that there's some sort of philosophical analysis that needs to be fed into that. Now, the stance machinery could well be a really useful way to cash out exactly how we see that first order scientific evaluation interacting with the philosophical analysis, and especially when we in sort of bring out all the different stancy type considerations, which is almost this is where the philosophy enters in these in the places where what we say about the evidence depends on a stancy type dispute. I still, my impression of this stuff though still is I'm a little, I still think it's being worked out, is my impression of how many stances we should allow. I feel a bit nervous about the possibility of getting to too many stances. And so, but I feel as though this is something that, is kind of the ongoing project to work out, but it definitely gives the machinery to talk productively about disagreements, both within science, because you see that sort of move to a meta level happening often in science, in order to achieve things. And I wonder also, it seems to, it was also just in the sort of realm of there being stances and paradigms. This is whole pretty discussion about paradigms and people went through a whole process in philosophy of science of also unraveling those into all these different components, methodological components, personality components. Now, so this is now a question to the stance people. Unravel is a stance. I should call it unravel. The sort of elaboration of the stance thing. How do you see that older Kuhnian project and ensure you're not reinventing the wheel there?
All right, so I would like to agree with everyone and disagree with everyone about something. Excellent. But let me start with convergence, because I do think that there's been a significant amount of convergence. I don't think that's stultifying in any way. I don't think it's ending debates. I don't think it is a problem. In fact, I think I take it only to be a sign of a very positive thing that we actually have better and more realistic views pertaining to science that allow us to be more fine-grained about our arguments. It's not a choice between realism and anti-realism, but there are ways in which instrumentalists are realists about certain things given certain conditions. There are ways in which scientific realists would say, in this case, the evidence isn't strong enough to be something like that would be mentioned, or what have you. Right? I'm reminded of a symposium on this book called Exceeding Our Grasp at the APA. So I had to look up on my hard drive because I can never remember when these things have happened now, but it was in 2007, in which an august group of people and me were discussing Kyle's book, and the end of my paper on that was all about how, having disagreed with Kyle about this, that, and the other, I said, look, it's really important here that we not lose sight of the fact that we actually agree on so much, which gives us the clarity to look at remaining disagreements in a really productive way. So I think the convergence is actually facilitating all kinds of important discussions, but I don't think the intensity of those discussions is going to lighten up, because as I'm fond of saying, whatever problems we have, expand to fill the available space. And so I think we will do very well pursuing those disagreements. So I don't think there are two sides anymore. I think there are lots of sides. I think, although it may make some discussions more difficult because there are lots of sides, I think it's important that we be true to the actual messiness of the epistemic situation and embrace the messiness and do the best we can with it, because it's better philosophy than it would be to pretend that there are two positions. So I think all of those things are good. Okay, so has the realism debate gone away? I would want to say no for all of those reasons. Even though there's been significant convergence, I think there are a lot of things for us to discuss. So let me just turn to the stance business. So a couple of points here. I've heard a couple of people say, look, if this is true, then again, this is a real worry. It's really stultifying. It's like ending debates. It's might be saying, oh, it's so discouraging. It's like, why should I participate in this debate at all? That's scientific realism, the stance voluntarism is true. But I think that's exactly the wrong moral to take. I mean, in an extreme case, one that I think would be overstating what's happening in the stance direction, is to think about Wittgenstein saying, look, some problems are pseudo problems. And one way to think about that, if he's right about particular cases, is to say, oh, you've ruined my life because you took away this problem that I was so concerned about. How dare you? But if he's right that that thing is a pseudo problem, then it's good that we learned that that thing is a pseudo problem, right? That's philosophical progress. And there's a sense in which I think I certainly wouldn't describe the stance literature as pointing to anything in the debates about scientific realism as being a pseudo-problem. But I do think that if it's right, there's one sort of epistemic anxiety that we are relieved from, right? So in a Wittgenstein age. And that epistemic anxiety is about sorting out who's right. Because it may turn out that there is more than one rational epistemic stance to take toward any particular domain of science or any particular scientific investigation. And so what that does is give us the freedom then to elaborate the stances that we might apply to that particular domain of science or that particular investigation and make it as sophisticated and compelling as we possibly can without having to worry about refuting refuting this person or refuting that person. What we can do is say, look, my inclination is to take this kind of stance. Now I can spend all my time trying to work out whether that's a sensible thing to do in this particular domain of science. And that, I think, is an amazingly empowering insight that follows from stance voluntarism. It's true. So I don't think it's stultifying at all. On the contrary, I think it's actually energizing and empowering because it opens up space to focus on a different kind of philosophical. Second, the 2 points that I'll make about stance voluntarism is that I don't think that myself, personally, this is something that we should argue about, of course, I don't really accept the idea that it's a useful and interesting thing to think about in disputes between, say, certain kinds of empiricists and certain kinds of realists. A lot of the discussion in my book on this takes that form, in part because of the original motivation of the book. The original motivation for the book was to tackle the question of, is there such a thing that we can make sense of that falls under this description naturalized metaphysics or scientific metaphysics or the metaphysics of science. Now, in answering that particular question, the dispute between people who are more empiricistically minded and more realistically, that's a terrible choice of terms, people who are more inclined towards forms of empiricism and people who are more inclined towards realism really does take center stage, because they're the former are saying don't even dabble into any kind of explication or elaboration of what scientists are talking about that may enter the realm of some metaphysical thinking. Other people saying no, the sciences give us the kind of data that allows us to actually elaborate what's being discussed in the sciences. So in that context, it makes sense to think about that contrast. But I actually think that the idea of stances applies across the board, not merely to realists and to certain kinds of realists and certain kinds of empiricists, but to all sorts of positions in the literature. And I don't think it's a question of distinguishing between, well, one debate between empiricists and realists is all about risk tolerance and the other is about evaluation of risk. Because I think both of those things are in play in all of these discussions. So in the empiricism versus realism one, it isn't just about risk tolerance. It isn't about saying, well, we all agree on what the risks are. Now I'm more tolerant than you, right? They don't agree about what the risks are either. I mean, that's part of what leads people to draw the line between the ways in which they think we can responsibly form beliefs and the ways in which they think, no, to be responsible, we should really suspend belief. That's part of what drives this, which is they don't assess the risks in this. So I think both of those things are in play, risk tolerance and evaluation of risk. And I take those things to be integral to actually thinking about historical arguments or myths on topics. Precisely because I don't think historical case studies present us with kind of data or a set of data that everyone will accept as a starting point for their analysis of whether we should be realists or anti-realists. In fact, I think Chrissy cited a paper of mine where I argued that case studies from the history of science do not settle debates about realism and anti-realism. And there are a whole host of reasons for that, which I won't now, but I think it's really difficult. One, for reasons of historiography, looking at what's actually happening in those cases, but also because the interpretation of those cases ends up requiring us to take certain philosophical stance to give an interpretation. So if, for example, here's just a flat-footed example. If you hold a kind of causal theory of reference, as opposed to a more descriptive theory of reference, and so causal is a descriptive theory of reference, as opposed to a theory of reference that puts a lot of weight on description, true or approximately true, you're going to say different things about what the morals of some of these case studies are. The realism and but that's just to say that realism and anti-realism are playing a role in how we evaluate the force of those historical techniques. So you can't get away, I think, from thinking about stances, even in that. So what I want to say is everyone, it's not just a person about context, but it's something valuable to think about in all of these contexts. Let me say one thing about this will be the last thing I say. Push back a little bit on the idea that the unobservable, observable distinction is something that we just need to leave behind and throw away. It's not interesting anymore. Pete was keen on this. That was his first epiphany. And I've heard, other people say that as well. Sandy said something to me on the first day, which I thought was very insightful. He said, do people think that just because, this is something that's been discussed so much, it was kind of integral to the new wave of the literature on realism and anti-realism. It took up so much oxygen and so much space that now we're just tired of it. Or the gloss I gave on that, and he said that to me with it might well be that everything that could possibly be said about it has been said, right? So is that why we should leave it aside? Or are we leaving it aside for more principled reasons, which is what I took some people to say. And I'm moved by the former. I think probably pretty much everything we could say about that.
Both can be true.
Right. True. But I really, and I'm quite happy to be the only one person in the room who thinks this. But I'm not moved by the idea that there are principled reasons to leave it. And a couple of reasons. One of them is that I do think there are philosophical traditions, and that distinction is incredibly important. And I think it's too siloed of us to marginalize them and think that they're unimportant even in the philosophy of science. So what I said to Curtis on the first day was that, look, I mean, when was the last time you picked up the crisis of the European sciences? I mean, Searle is worried that the life world, which is the world we live in, is being replaced by a bunch of abstractions and idealizations, which we have no idea necessarily how to connect to the life world. And that's a problem. That's something that we need to think about, right? Just to quote Nancy Cartwright, some interesting former supervisor, in a paper somewhere, she said, look, you can understand where the empiricist is coming from because we are creatures bound in a world of sensation, right? Now, I don't feel particularly bound, but I take that seriously because we live right in the life world and we are debating about how to interpret the outputs of sciences in a way that connects it. And so I don't think that we have principled reasons to say to people who are really concerned about the life world as a first priority, right? That's something we should stop worrying about and throw away, or we should take seriously the idea that that might be how we should understand, or we should see the outputs of the sciences through that lens. Because I think, one, it's really important to a lot of philosophers. Right? It's important to a lot of phenomenologists, some of whom are excellent philosophers of science. And because it has, I think, really important connections to what I was hinting at in my talk. I think connections between the philosophy of science and issues of science and society. Because when it comes to, for example, the focusing on science education, I think one of the things that we really need to focus on in science education is, in fact, the idea of acceptance, right, as opposed to ability. I do actually think that distinction matters for the reason that acceptance, being a weaker doxastic attitude and belief, allows for people who are realists, right, because they can furthermore believe theories. But it also allows people who say, this science stuff is a lot of, mumbo jumbo. How can you take these models seriously when they use these idealizations as described in the book? That's something you need to think. It allows them to get on board because they see why accepting a scientific model or scientific theory might be a really good thing to do. Because you can do all kinds of really important work. But that's just another way of saying that actually this distinction between the observable consequences of a theory and the theoretical content of the theory, to use the old-fashioned terminology, is actually really important in my estimation. So that's just a pushback on that idea.
And I think at this point it would be a good idea to open the discussion to everyone. So the first question is over there.
You already started. You do.
Okay, I have a question. Okay, thanks. I wanted to put an anxiety to you that you make that hopefully you can resolve, which is directly building off about are we not just reinventing the wheel here, right, by making this meta-level move by dealing with the stances in particular, then focusing on that aspect of the conversation. So yeah, I mentioned Cart myself, and they can say, okay, well, later interpreters have made way more of his supposed meta-philosophical claims than he himself did. So bracket that. Then there's Kuhn, right, who not at the meta level, but at the first order level, basically does a lot of things that are structurally very, very similar to what now we're doing at the meta level. And then you have a very similar dialectic, right, where there's a realization, oh no, we need common ground. How do you spell it out? Well, maybe epistemic criteria can help, but no, that's not quite compelling enough because of reasons X, Y, Z. And then it's not just Kuhn, right? It's Lauder and Lagatosh. You might include style of reasoning approach in there, and so many other examples of this general sort of template. And interestingly, we might know, well, what impact they had. Well, we still acknowledge these people by name a lot for some of the wider influence they had, but in Kuhn's case, the general idea that we can reconstruct disagreement in the history of science in terms of these broad paradigms is also largely been put by the wayside exactly because people were skeptical of the basic idea that we can identify and conceptualize this well-defined higher level type of structure grounding the disagreements. So why should we be optimistic that it's going to be different with the stance of it?
Yes, so we go to our next question on the points.
Not so much of a question, I guess, just a couple of things. So in response to Kai's point about the stance does not have much to do with the historical approach. I just want to echo what Anjan said. That's exactly what I was thinking. But I also wanted to just share a little bit of my personal journey, an intellectual journey. What got me initially excited about the stance stuff was seeing parallels between first order scientific activity and philosophical activity. So seeing parallels between first order scientific activity, scientific practice, and philosophical practice, philosophical philosophizing about science, right? So I started off thinking about, obviously I worked with Nancy, so very that pragmatist thing is hanging over my head like right from the beginning, but my dissertation, I started thinking about multiple roles in science and different theories serve different roles. And so Nancy and I wrote this paper like what's so special about empirical adequacy, and Nancy likes to be provocative and I think it's pretty cool. But we talked about different different scientific theories and models are used for different goals. And so we don't need a one size fits all thing. So in that vein, coming to your point, Asaph makes this point about interpreting first order scientific evidence, right? Is dependent on your values. Evidence is not, nature is not screaming out at us. This is what the evidence is. There's always interpretation, which is what Anjan is saying. And that the quantity and quality of evidence, even where you look for evidence is colored by values. And so again, going back to the idea of parallel between scientific activity being value labeled and philosophy of science being value labeled. So I think that's where the stance stuff comes in. I think stances do play a role, whether consciously or unconsciously interpreting second order historical evidence, just like first order scientific evidence. So that was one of it. And then second, to Leah's point about are we reinventing the wheel? I don't have a definitive yes or no, with regard to Kuhn's work. Maybe we are, but I don't think that's a problem. Because I think it's valuable to talk about the same thing in different ways. Philosophers, as a discipline, I think that we do that all the time. I think it's useful to talk about the same whole concept in very different ways. So I don't know if I want to say that stances are the same thing as paradigms. I mean, there has been some connection made between those two things. And I was talking to Julian about it. I think it's Martin Bush that makes that connection, I'm not sure. So I think there is a lot of commonality between stances and paradigms, but I think that's okay. To slightly different ways of talking about the same, maybe the same point.
Now we're over thinking, arguing stances should be understood along the lines of paradigms. And I responded to that in my 2014 paper, What is a Stand? And yeah, I mean, back at this point, I mean, in some ways, nothing new under the sun. And I am struck when writing about stances by similarities with Kuhn. And the point about the disagreement, like Bruno was talking about, the difficulty of resolving stance-based view. And the one, the advocate one stance convincing their opponent that you've given deep disagreement, given the lack of common ground, given that stance arguments seem to presuppose the stance being debated. All of that is extremely relevant. And I don't think that's a bad thing in terms of the general idea. It clearly has a lot of fun with treating paradigms, but I don't think stances, for us in sense and adjunct sense, are scientific paradigms. I think they're different. The details are very different. But I have some similar epistemological features, I think. But I don't think that's likely to, I personally don't think that's a huge problem.
Anjan, have you immediate follow-up? And Curtis?
Yeah, actually, this would be really quick because it's really just to further what Sandy said. I think there are a lot of analytical constructs in the philosophy of science that share certain features, the styles of reasoning, paradigms, frameworks, stances, etc. But I think those similarities are at a very high level of abstraction. They are commitments that people make that then shape how they go about describing what they believe and how they know and so on and so forth. But I think the stance literature is quite different actually from the paradigm literature, because what's crucial for Kubernetes is to take, first of all, a historicist view of what knowledge is, whereas the stance literature is meeting open question of what scientific knowledge means. Two different people with different stances will describe it. But probably most important is the sociological dimensions in this picture of stances, of paradigms, is not something that's easy to map onto the stance literature. It's not that we all are interested in sociological views and subscribe to the same stance, and then we find anomalies of a crisis, and then we have a period in which we find it out, and then we all agree to adopt another stance. And I think the dynamics theory change and choice in quite different from what we envision as stances. So I meant to be short.
I'm not exactly sure how to put this, but I think in the spirit of sort of the meta level reflections and stuff, it's important to sort of step outside and think about why we have philosophical discourse in the first place, right? Even if we are sort of reinventing the past or recapitulating the same debates over and over, the reason is because we're not 100 years old. We weren't there for those original debates. We weren't there having those conversations, and things continued on, and new developments and new pieces of relevance have popped up. And so, sure, let's draw on the past, let's look back, but you can't just say, "Oh, sorry, have you not read the entire history of philosophy? We already did this." It's this sort of thing where we are in the moment that we're in, because that sort of conversation is at present for us as a group of people. And there's going to be, maybe it's a cycle, maybe it's a development, who knows? But in 100 years, I don't think anybody's going to be still, incessantly talking about that philosophy of science. Maybe a new anti-realist can sort of come in to speak to the questions of the day, right? Like, maybe there'll be a new aspirant anti-realist empiricist that phrases things a little different than him. And there's nothing wrong with looking back and seeing styles of the past and reinventing them for the present, right? But we do them in new fabrics and with new methods. And I think we need to position ourselves and our discourse within our contemporary moment, not forget that we're here because we are puzzled. We are trying to figure things out. Just because somebody said something before doesn't mean it's all the same.
Okay, so I want to renounce my naive views like 5 minutes ago.
Just from what?
No, I'm keeping a lot of them. The one I expressed a few minutes ago, I want to answer. So let me start by saying, and I don't think you misunderstood me to think this, but in no way am I saying stances are dumb or bad or unimportant or anything like that, right? Part of what I'm seeing is that this is a broad enough thing that people said actually in a couple different ways, going to be relevant to an awful lot of what we do epistemically and otherwise. And I take that point on behalf of stances. So there's no shade being thrown on stances as a general matter. And I am convinced by what he said that, look, think about stances and kind of thing people are describing as being, yeah, that's even gonna be the sort of thing that will influence how you interpret an historical evidence, an historical episode, or what kind of that evidence for what you take that historical episode to be providing. So I wanna, the way in which I wanna very explicitly take back what I was saying is, yeah, I was wrong. There are ways in which differences among stances will be contributing to or part of the disagreement, even in the historical form of the realism beta code. Look, what I'm going to start calling after today the historicist realism debate. Right? So yeah, for the reason you said, I think, yeah, it's even going to come in and matter there. But I also want to sort of dig in and insist on the difference between that and what seems to me the way it was originally envisioned, that stances were going to help us understand or make sense of persistent disagreement in realism debate, right? It is not because we understand what the historicist, the two sides of the many splendored sides of the historicist realism debate. It's not something like risk tolerance or other stancy features that's sort of at the heart of what their disagreement is. They take their disagreement to be an empirical, factual one. And so, yeah, I hadn't thought about it. And yeah, your stance is going to influence how you interpret things like historical evidence. So yes, indeed, that's going to be part of, why even people who are just paying attention to historical evidence are going to keep disagreeing. But I think that's an importantly different picture from how stances are going to explain persistent disagreement that I was trying to push against.
Yeah, just on that, so that's like the spirit is kind of haunted the conference a bit, right? So, interpret, obviously that's an historical case study. You interpret in a certain way, and from the standpoint of practical stance, he says he thinks of his practices and his realism as stances, and it's not really that he just looks at the historical evidence and infers that the correct position on realism or pragmatism is this or that. He clearly is interpreting just an episode or whatever with a particular, pragmatist, pluralist, whatever philosophical stance in mind, which colors the way he's doing the history. And he'd probably be open about that, and that's perfectly fine. It's not criticism. I think that fits the view.
So coming to the stances, I would like to ask for some clarification for a lot of quite sure of the point. So, as Sandy and Curtis pointed out, we can choose between the stances. So there's actually three choices good. While Anjan says, okay, there is a technical, there's one, but doesn't mean that you've got a free will to just choose the stance. So, it's important to use as concept of life, and I'd be interested if you actually link it more towards that direction. That, okay, a stance is really, it's not just a precondition of our specific theoretical view, but it's really the product of our categorization, socialization, proselytization. So it's not something you can slip in and out, it's just fixed. While you would more say it's the basis of our theoretical assumptions. And that is something we can't change, which is in a way influenced by our life role, but it's not permanent.
So I think there is a really interesting point of probably disagreement between perhaps Curtis and Sandy on one side. I'm not sure how we shared your views on this, but you did co-write a paper, so I assume there's one brain that's being split into two people. But I think there is a really interesting and substantive possible difference here. I think this is part of what's exciting. We'll find out because we're going to have to, have conversations about this to work it out. But I'm not sure I characterize it in exactly the way you did. So it certainly isn't my intention, and I don't think I've suggested anywhere that the stances that we hold are, for example, fixed by our acculturation. It would be silly, I think, not to think that that might not be a factor in various cases.
For sure.
But I think it's very, very difficult to imagine what kind of scientific work it would take to actually work out what the deterministically relevant variables are in determining why the person adopts one stance as opposed to another, right? It isn't that everyone who has one PhD supervisor ends up holding the same stance, right? I mean, it's like, so cultural variables are real, but I have no confidence in our ability to assess their impact on the stances that people adopt. I think there are a lot of things that one might take into account as being relevant. But, you know, certainly in the scientific context, remember, we're people who love to disagree. So whatever we may begin with, I think we're very good at playing devil's advocate with both ourselves, certainly with others, try harder in the first case. But which leads me to think that it can't just be a matter of cooperation. There's also more that goes into it. But I think that there is a point that we reach at which, and other people have written about this, there's something fundamentally mysterious or okay about why it is we happen to have this stances. That said, I don't think this is another thing that I would like to endorse. The idea that once we have a stance, that's it, we're set. Right? Precisely because it's in the cut and thrust of all of these discussions and debates that I think our stances can change. In just the same way that our values can change. No one thinks that, you know, you're born with a set of values and then they remain constant throughout the rest of your life. I think these are things that can evolve precisely in part because you think about the stances of others. What I think stance volunteerism really requires, though, is a certain amount of cognitive empathy. For that to happen, you need to be able to try to put yourself in the shoes of someone else and say, why did they think that? What are their values such that that makes sense to them? And sometimes you do, you actually find yourself shifting your values as well. You realize some of those things may resonate with you as well. So I don't want to say that they're fixed. What I do want to say is that we can't change the willy-nilly. And I'm not sure what I don't think that's what these guys are saying at all. But if you give the impression of saying, well, you can choose this one, you can choose that one, blah, 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 it leads to questions like Ludwig's. So are you just saying I can choose whatever stance I want? Or, you know, I think Maddie's discomfort is like, well, I could just like pick any of these stances. I don't think those things, because I think the stances are a function of your epistemic and political values. And so that's the sense in which I think Harry Frankfurt is right, that what's involved here is a kind of volitional necessity. You have a choice in the sense that there are probably different rational options. So there's a sense in which you have a choice among them. But given, right, the background commitments you don't have a choice. You will adopt the stance that fits with those values. Background commitments.
I forgot we need to hear from those guys on the same issue. Forget it.
Yeah, cheers. I think Anjan and I ultimately, if we sat down, we figured this out. I'll come close to it. I have a snarky impulse in me about a lot of things. An old professor of mine, Bernie Linsky, taught early modern philosophy, and his demonstration of the reality of free will was to hold a piece of chalk and say, there it is. There's my free will, right? And so my impulse almost, and my snarky impulse is to be like, well, watch me. I believe in elections. No, I don't. Which is not what I believe. That's not how I find my ability to switch between these things. It's not something where it's just this flip a switch and a pure matter of free will. It is very relevant. It's very much informed my take on this. Because I find it is driven by context, and it's driven by the values that are most salient in those contexts, where I find myself suddenly inhabiting an anti-realist perspective, because I find that to be the most prudent thing to do, in that, without running the calculation overtly, right? Somebody who's just like a boldly naive realist in a conversation, instead of a conversation. Sure, I'm helping them understand the debate, occupy an anti-realist perspective. Let's But in that context, I really sort of start to convince myself sometimes. And so I definitely don't think it's willy-nilly, but I think it's a very interesting and understood aspect of this whole thing. That is another one of these avenues that we should be pursuing as a group to really get some good clarity on just how elastic our commitments.
Maybe just really.
One really, yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, I'm not certain how much disagreement there is between our paper and Anjan's work. I thought of ourselves as not so much disagreeing as far as filling in some of the gaps or maybe pushing it further in certain directions that I wouldn't necessarily disagree with, but that's still perhaps a bit of an open question. But since writing the paper, I've been challenged by, I mentioned my sociological colleague at UNE, Alan Scott, who has imported this notion of stances, but has been quite critical of what he interprets as the liberal individualist notion of stance. You just adopt a stance based on your values, and you just kind of choose it as a spectrally isolated, individual, as a sociologist, isolated capitalist. He wants to come for a historicized capitalist stance for us, and he talks about the scientific spirit in the scientific revolution as being a kind of stance, like the empirical stance, but one that was the almost inevitable ideological or philosophical counterpart to developments going on at the time, somewhat Marxist account, right? Where it's not just you choose your stance, it's the culturation, it's the historical and social context and cultural context and influence and so on. I want to take on board some of this. I argue in my book that you can still be voluntarist, but accept a lot of what he says about the historicization of stance choice, because voluntarism is fundamentally the view that rival stances are rationally permissible, and that your stance is a function of your values. And whether your values, are fixed, or whether your stance is a kind of almost inevitable product of your values. Right? So I've argued that Darwin's gradualism, metaphysical gradualism, was a kind of Van Prassian stance. And that seemed very strongly by his culture, by the culture of Victorian England and the unquestioned commitment to gradual progress and improvement. But maybe not all of it, but that was a big influence on his gradualist stance. So I want to hang on to a kind of voluntarism while allowing perhaps a stronger form of cultural influence and so on than I used to accept and that I feel in John Jones.
And so we should really come to an end now. We have 2 more questions, but I really must have to make it short. Now.
Thank you for all discussions. I just first want to say that perhaps yesterday I was wrong to target my concern toward Anjan's stance voluntarism and to annoy him perhaps in this way. At the same time, because I think that, stance voluntarism has its own function in explaining the deep disagreement that we experience in the realism debate and in other debates that we have in philosophy more generally. But still, I want to defend the kind of concern that I had, and I want to propose, because we are now thinking about the future direction of the realism debate. I try to make it short. It's about the relation between, connection between meta-level reflections and kind of discussions that we have now, we had in recent days, and the debates at the, within philosophy itself. So at the first, what I call the first order debates in philosophy. And so the kind of concern that I have is that this connection is not so clear. So the kind of lessons that we can have, as philosophers of science discussing the issues on realism, scientific knowledge, the relation to reality, the nature of scientific models and theories, and so on and so forth in philosophy. So the connection between these kinds of debates and the other kinds that we had in recent treatises on meta-level reflections, this connection is not so clear. So the kind of lessons that we can have from meta level reflections. How can we make progress? I targeted it toward Anjan, but it's perhaps it was wrong. And more generally, I have this concern that how can we make progress in the debate? I have something, and just two points that perhaps I could suggest. One is about the notion of a stalemate. I remember that with Frederick and Matthias, we had some discussions whether we should use this term in our announcement of the project of the conference or not. And I disagreed because I didn't like this term. Just because, not because it's wrong, it's a wrong description of the situation, but it's too general, and it's not helpful in the sense, in the way that I'm concernful about. That it doesn't clarify what kinds of questions are wrong in the debate and which one are good questions, and it's too general. There is a stalemate. But what questions or problems are pseudo problems and what are not, and in what direction we should proceed with the debate. And the last point is that it's perhaps something that can be helpful, I think, in the direction of the debate is making connection between these two levels and helping the debate itself from the perspective of the meta level reflection. I feel nervous. Just 1 minute. And the last one is a kind of just the kind of approach that I had in my own work in recent years on the realism debate, because it didn't come up in our discussion. I just wanted to mention it. It's kind of integrative approach. It's perhaps have some similarities with what Bruno said about finding commonalities in the debate and shared values and commitments. But it's a bit different. It's not just finding shared values, commitment, beliefs, etc. But it's finding insights in different positions and trying to integrate it. And I think Anjan himself is one of the person who has done that in integrating structural realism and entity realism, and that's perhaps the kind of work that we can do in the next phase of the realism debate. So far, we have had a lot of different views, accounts. We have studied different cases and different insights, in different philosophical positions that we have. Perhaps now we can integrate the insights that we have found in these different positions, and that could be a proposal for next. Okay, thank you.
This is a question for Anjan. Do you remember during my dissertation defense when the chair said stalemate is the wrong term for what you guys are talking? Like the guy who was just hosting, he wasn't an external or anything, but he was a chess player. He said stalemate's the wrong term. You remember that? Do I know you?
I have no recollection.
No recollection on that. So I think on this point about whether stalemate is exactly what's happening, what we should do is start exploring other terms. He said there's a different term for what you're talking about in chess. It's not a stalemate. Stalemate doesn't refer to that. It refers to something else. And I totally forget what the term is, but I'm going to look it up and I'll get back to you. Or get back to everybody.
Probably it's a suswa.
Maybe, it might be, yeah. But I think that's sort of an interesting thing we could explore is other terms for sort of like intractable.
I can't really respond to everything Monty said. There was an awful lot in there, but I think it is worth noting. I at least meant to be suggesting a straightforward recipe for progress in the scientific realism debate. And maybe I will tie that to this idea that's just recently been articulated that I think is right about the kind of a wide variety of ways in which something like stances matter. So what I suggested is, look, we made a mistake where it's not working posits doesn't work. What might work? That doesn't work. What might work? The straightforward recipe for progress in the philosophy of science in the realism debate is stop looking for the next thing that's going to capture everything. Go back and look at more cases of working posits. Look at more cases of structure. Look at more cases of the things we already know it's not going to be the magic criterion that tells us what to do, but we haven't looked like. And so I connect this to a kind of philosophical culture, or culture and philosophy that Anjan mentioned this briefly that really values novelty. And the philosophical point is novelty. Nobody wants to do normal science. Everybody wants to do revolutionary science. And there's way worse in philosophy than science that everybody wants to do revolutionary science. So and so there's I think in some ways stance dependent tendency of philosophers to say, oh no, well that wouldn't work in posits, that wouldn't be my thing. It's not novel enough. It's not novel enough if I come in with a new great argument for why working posits it's more complicated than we thought, or they really are a good sign of this, and we have some further examples. That's not enough novelty for me to be a big time philosopher who rocked everybody's world. But look, maybe I'll close this somewhat wandering comment by saying the problem going to see alternatives wasn't anything new, right? That's 2M. I just said what 2M said, right? That wasn't the important part. The important part was going and finding the historical stuff to put meat on those bones. And philosophers are part of what frustrates me about this rekindling of the natural philosophy thing is that academic philosophers are currently, by temperament, by stance, maybe sort of hostile to that kind of work, right? To chipping away at the things we do in science. Sorry, I'm sure I promised it was going to be short.
Yeah, I promised this last.
Okay.
Yeah, I promise to. Yeah, I just want to sort of re-emphasize something that Anjan and Curtis both said about the place of this debate, that we don't go away focusing only on the sort of academic direction that this debate can take, because we actually are in a very alarming moment when it comes to, the issue of truth about science. And in a way, yeah, I mean, we're supposed to be the experts on this. So we should really, I think, take seriously this question of how to bring the insight that we get from this project out into education, towards policy making, towards general audiences, because I'm not sure who else is so well positioned in a way to do it.
So we have a last question for the Ibrahim, and you promised to be very short. So
Thank you very much. I have two questions. The first is, what do you think about Pseudo's claim that we can talk about the victory of realism, because the debates now more about the aspects of the unobservables we know or we don't know. This is the first. The second is about metaphysics. Do you think that metaphysics played any role which are debate? I think more that we talk about pragmatic turn and localist approach, but I think more that something like the metaphysical turn in this debate. Pseudos also talks about this, that there's a shift from epistemological questions to ontological and metaphysical questions. In recent year, as you know, there are big literature about causation, laws of nature, and so on. What do you think about metaphysics in this? Thank you.
So I feel a little bit right here. Does anyone have a really short answer?
I say something.
Only a bit one.
Well, I'm only going to say so. What is the role of metaphysics of all this is a really big question. So I'm only going to hazard a quick answer to the first question. And it is, look, I think the idea of saying, hey, realism won, because now we're talking about which aspects of the unobservable stuff. Nobody's really pushing the view that it's just observable stuff anymore. And so realism won. There may be some technical sense in which that's true, but it's also profoundly unhelpful. It's an example of what I was saying when I said the shared project is what's important, and trying to answer the question of who won the original. Nobody won the original scientific realism debate, because it turned out to be way more complicated than that. And so I think, you know, the truth value of the claim that you made is true. But when we should, that's not the question. That's not the way to think about it.
Thank you. So I'm sorry to cut it at this point, but we should really finish well over our time. So let's thank our keynote speakers again.